So I'm speaking for myself. Any views, opinion expressed, not that of the Coca-Cola company. So just get that out of the way. I think to have a discussion on this is very important to have a definitional conversation. What exactly is packaging? We touched on this earlier. And I think it's actually a little bit not so straightforward. I will begin by just contrasting food contact substance versus food contact materials. I think every talk will always have to touch on 409H6, the definition for food contact substance. And I'm not a lawyer, but I thoroughly enjoy this passage. I think it's something good to have a group study, just analyzing the wisdom that's been imparted into this language. Because you look at this, any substance that's intended for use as a component of materials used in manufacturing, packaging, packing, packaging, transporting, holding food, if such use of substance is not intended to have any technical effect in the food. Now, I also put in bracket as consumed. I think, let me just pause here. I think, if the last word food is not understood as consumed, then you become having a circular argument. Then what is this food different than the previous food in the third line? But I think the different people that I talked to, and I think we have many people from the FDA here can correct me whether it's generally understand the last word food is food as consumed. My understanding is yes, it is. So I think what's the beauty of this is that the statutory definition, among other things, provides the concepts of intended use, which is very important. The requirements of inertness, the word not have any technical effect. The connection to food that's consumed. There's a very important things to be said there. And what I think is often overlooked is a hierarchy of supply chain. We talk about supply chain in earlier talks. Greg Pache from Sun Chemical talked about supply chain. The supply chain is actually baked in to the statutory language. You talk about substance used in materials used in packaging. Now, why do I think this is important? I thought let's just compare, contrast what the European says. They have a definition called food contact materials. And really it's not a definition at all. It's an enumerated list of things that are food contact materials. It's actually given in Annex 1 of Regulation 1935-2004, and most of the time is shorthanded as the Framework Regulation. Now, there are 17 of those. Now, I, for one, use chopsticks quite a bit in eating, and most of the time chopstick is made of bamboo. I don't see bamboo there, so does that mean the Europeans don't use bamboo? How is that going to be regulated? Do I see grass? GRASS? No. You see, the bifurcation of the regulation begin at the very outset. And so let me just say that, regardless of whether we use food contact substance or food contact material, the fact that the distinction exists is something we need to hang on to, because a lot of the time the difficulty begins when people do not distinguish substance from materials to articles. Because when people don't make that distinction, people cannot communicate. That this whole thing breaks down because you say, oh, this is proprietary. Well, it's proprietary to the extent you have formulary complexity. But if you are selling something that's based on a standard, as in the case of pure substance, that you have more obligation to disclosure. On the other hand, if I'm making an article, I am already taking care of how to make it inert. And I should focus on disclosure and communication on how inert it is, because I cannot say I don't know the use. I know the use very well because it's very peculiar, specifically made to your specification. The last thing is about food as consumed, is that the two supply chains are different. And I think the problem a lot is not only that people don't distinguish the different linkage in the supply chain, which is amply supported by the statutory definition, but also that it's a distinct supply chain from that of food, of the edible food. When you try to have a conversation and try to obliterate all this distinction, then yes, we will have a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and then the public is not well served. Having said that, just on the word packaging, let's move on to risk. For the purpose of this, I'm going to use a substance which I think, well, food contact substance or particular material that's, I say have no, I'm just using this as an example for the purpose of illustration. This particular material called SPAT, or simply called as SPG modified terephthalate. It's a polyester that was introduced by Mitsubishi Gas Chemical and uses a special glycol called spiroglycol, which is shown at the lower left. Okay? So if you don't use the spiroglycol as a comonomer, if you just polarize terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol, you get the bottle grade PET. I kind of generalize a little bit, simplify somewhat. There's ethylene glycol and diethylene glycol, but for the purpose, just say terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol is what we use to get the polyester bottles. If you can modify that to give it more heat resistance to bring the glass transition temperature above water, boiling temperature, so that you can put it in a dishwasher, okay, you probably want to use it. In the case of the FDA did risk management and risk assessment and was, after 120 days, issued the FCN 1135. All the people that are downstream benefit from the use of it. Now let's look at Europe. It was submitted by FSA of the UK. Interestingly, now that with Brexit, what's going to happen? But now we know that it was given a risk assessment on October 2014, then went to the commission. So this is about 2 years later, and then just a little bit over a month ago, the regulation was published. Okay. This is the kind of timeline that industry has to deal with. So if you have something that was introduced in 2010, you have something in 2012 from the FDA, you have 2014 from EFSA, but that really does not get you anything with a legal standing until 2016, which was just a couple months ago. So why is this relevant? I thought let's talk about migrating for a little bit. FDA lists the material as a polymer that consists of the three monomers. Okay, so terephthalic acid polymer with ethylene glycol, and the loan name is the SPG. And the intended use is there. If you make it less than 5 millimeter, you're okay. If you use it based on this Stoichiometry, you can use conditions of U C through G or B through H. That's the parameter that are given. However, the opinion that was issued, it now has this, let's focus on the bottom part. The migration, the substance itself does not exceed 5 ppm, and the migrations of oligomers does not exceed 50 ppb. Now, this is interesting. Many people in the consulting industry begin to wax poetry about EFSA begin regulating oligomers and oligomers NIAs and so on and so forth. So by the time it gets to the regulation that was published, it not only talk about 50 ppb, but now it says if you're really going to do this, you need to have a well-described method, you need to have a competent authority that can verify the compliance and adequate sample, you need calibration. Now let's just think, for those that, with some chemistry training, how exactly are you going to do this if the sample is not commercial? Okay? And if you're going to do this, how are you going to collect enough oligomer fractions to do the calibration, to do the identification, to purify enough? This is quite a tremendous challenge, as opposed to just say that I measure the thickness to be 5 millimeter. Okay? Now, just to recap what, from industry perspective, if I am a manufacturer interested in this, I will have this company in Japan introduce this to the market. In April 2012, this has an effective FCN. After that, you can rely on the effective FCN to market. Prior to that, really, you still had the options of doing GRAS through scientific procedures and do that. Okay? I don't think people will be foolish enough to do that, but it's not really illegal, but you have you have the FCN route that you do want to rely on. On the European side, then what we see here is an interesting situation where prior to EFSA opinion, it is unsafe or unevaluated. After the EFSA opinion issue is safe, but it's illegal. And finally, until August of this year, it becomes safe and legal. So that brings us to the observations and conclusion portion. I will say that both the US and EU had determined the same polymer, which doesn't know whether it's physically, this lump of plastics is in Europe or in the US or Canada. Both have laid down parameters and both have pronounced it to be safe. But the thing is, the parameters that are laid down to describe safety are very distinct one from the other. And I think the incongruence of these two parameters creates problem, because most of the time people will say this is okay in US and not in EU, or vice versa. And this compliance gap invariably will be interpreted as a safety gap. I think I put this, just for the sake of argument, the circle and the square have the same area, enough to protect the mouse, or should I say Charles River rat. Now, let's just look at it differently. Which one are you better protected from this Charles River rat, whether it's by concentric circles or a bunch of squares? Or are you troubled by the fact that just a little bit of, in and out is making you unsafe? I think that's the kind of things that the public is grappled with because it's not easy to comprehend this kind of distinction. Unfortunately, it's not just two. I'm glad to see Anastasia here from Health Canada. We actually have three different systems, just like as we have three different kind of geometry framework. You can use rectangular, you can use cylindrical, you can use spherical. Whichever shape you use has its natural ways to describe, but one works better than the other two. But what happened is that we are confined to one particular kind of framework that makes it very awkward to describe safety, as in the case that I just used, SPG I used to illustrate. So how can we overcome that? That's kind of going to be my last slide. What can we do? I suppose it's probably, if there's anything we can kind of overcome this kind of miscommunication and misunderstanding, perhaps we need some kind of language that transcends. Because, unlike the food additives, you can talk about food category, functional class, ADI, and so on. Yes, we can talk about the difference between WHO, JECFAs, and, all that. But by and large, the framework are the same. You can, just like you can convert kilometer per hour to miles per hour to meter per second. It's possible to make some kind of conversion and still be very precise. The problem is, if I were to tell you, your vehicle wheel cannot revolve more than 40 revolutions per second, and you will not have odometer, and you try to comply with the speed limit, how are you going to do that? Invariably, you will have gaps. So, last thing, this is my final slide. I know I'm out of time, but what I think may be helpful is this. Consider this is, oversimplified toxicology, and I'm not a toxicologist. If we take NOEL and we know that we back 100-fold or more, we get to ADI. Or in Europe, they call it TDI because it's regarded as contaminant. Now, we know that we talk about threshold regulation. If you are 100th of ADI, you can do threshold regulation. Most of the substances that of interest to what's called NIAS, such as printing inks, such as adhesive components, they are so highly formulated, such small contribution, they are way, way beyond on the far left-hand side. So safe, you have such huge margin of safety that's not really recognized or much talked about. And I think as long as we do not drive a distinction between food ingredients and food contact and do not talk about the safety that's inherent in there, I think we will have a lot of difficulty convincing the public that we are doing a good job protecting public health. So with that, I will close. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions.